Hi, this is Chris Morrow at Comic-Con Home, and we're talking about the panel, A Tribute to Dennis O'Neil, Beyond Batman. You can introduce yourself and tell us where you are at home.
I am Dr. Travis Langley, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Henderson State University. I am in my office at the moment.
Hi, I'm Larry Hama. I'm a writer, penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, chief bottle washer, and I'm talking to you from wonderful Slate Hill, New York. Mike?
Is it my turn now?
No,
I know it's Joe's.
It's Joe Duffy's turn.
I was waiting to be sure Larry wasn't just pausing for a second.
Okay.
I'm Joe Duffy. I am in my home office in beautiful Brighton Beach, New York. It's a glorious day out, but I'm indoors cowering like a little chicken because of COVID-19. And I worked with Denny for many years when he was at Marvel. And I am a writer, I am an editor, I am a proofreader, I sing, I dance, I'm a busybody. You know, whatever you need, there I am. Next.
My name is Charles Catchment. I'm editorial director at Abrams ComicArts, an imprint of the art book publisher Abrams. I'm an editor. I work with Denny on a couple of novels, including Batman Nightfall. And I am in Columbus Circle, New York City, with the windows closed and the AC down. So, joyous summer of COVID here in New York.
I am Mike Gold. I am an editor and a media metaphysician and a broadcaster. And, you know, whatever you need, I'll wind up doing it eventually, but I will be late. I worked with Denny. I shared an office with Denny at DC for 3 years. I had an office next to him for, geez, I don't know, a billion years. And together we did a bunch of stuff, most important of that being the question. Oh.
Hi, I'm Michael Uslan. I'm the originator and executive producer of the Batman film franchise, but more importantly, I knew Denny for almost 50 years. And it was Denny who brought me into the business, gave me my first shot at being a comic book writer over at DC. And to me, he is one of the most important writers in the history of comics, and arguably maybe the most important writer of the Silver Age of comics in particular.
I'm Danny Fingeroth. I worked with Denny when he was an editor at Marvel Comics. When he was unimaginably old, he was 40 years old, which was insane to us younger assistants. I worked with him. He was my editor on a comic called The Dazzler, and we spent just over the years a lot of very pleasant lunches and dinners and events and taught together. And I interviewed him for my biography of Stan Lee, which came out recently, and Denny knew everybody, knew everything, and could phrase it in a unique and way that you always learn something, whatever he said. And he was just like a swell guy.
Well, nice to meet you all. And I know that we're kind of short on time. I'm hoping that you can recap the panel discussion. What did you guys talk about?
Well, we talked about Denny O'Neil,
yeah,
one of the most important people in the history of comics, who was our friend, colleague, teacher, mentor. I mentioned I'm a professor, but I'm best known as the author of the book Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night, and editor, lead writer on a number of other books, one recently on the Joker, and Denny helped me with these books. And I am somebody who grew up with, he wrote the first comic book I ever read, and it is an honor to have known him as a person, got to be friends with him. And when he died, Comic-Con was finalizing their panel list, and I got in touch with them and said, could we do a tribute to him? And so Danny Fingeroth helped me pull together this group of people. We talked about how we knew Denny. We talked about his importance in comics, his qualities as a person, some of his own struggles throughout life. And since my role was more as moderator, I'm going to let my friends, colleagues here, them tell you about the rest of the panel.
Denny was also the social and moral conscience of this field, of this wonderful, grossly extended family, which represents all types of people. Denny, sorry, Charlie, I know you got the beard and all that, but Denny was our rabbi. Denny was our moral conscience, and he would express himself so sweetly, so nice, so polite, skills I've never managed to master, but brilliantly. And for that alone, he deserves credit.
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, Denny was this sort of force that it's hard to imagine comics and movies and the superheroes that we know of today without Denny, because he so systematically had an effect on everything, whether it was the editors that he trained and hired to follow in his footsteps, the writers he gave that first job, like Frank Miller, the writers who were influenced by people like Frank Miller or by the other books that he's done, whether it's Neil Gaiman or Alan Moore. The effect was really profound on the movies that Michael Uslan has produced. I think he's arguably one of the most significant creators in comics who had a hand in sort of influencing everything. And we sort of talk about that in the panel, why that is, that he put the dark back in the Dark Knight. He brought back a sort of a moral conscience to comics, and not that comics weren't moral, but they were kind of light fluff, and he sort of made them more serious at a time when they sort of reeling them back right after the Batman TV show, sort of pointing them in a new direction.
I think that in light of what's happening currently with all these people railing against comics being too political, is that Denny was one of the first people that really brought his own liberal sensibilities to the comics and put them out there, and it wasn't like that before. Between him and Stan, they created a sea change about the ethical and moral standards of comic book heroes. And I think that's a huge, huge difference.
There used to be a sense that the hero fought the villain because they were enemies. Right. I don't like you, you're my opponent. And the morality was, you've got to stop because what you are doing is wrong. What you are doing is hurting people. We can't put up with this. And Denny was one of the, little white boy that he was, Denny was one of the first people who literally had a character say to one of the heroes, "What have you done for the black people? Sure, you're out there saving the day for the whites. What are you doing for my community?" And it's a question that gets asked every day now. But when Denny started doing it in the late 60s, early 70s, that was probably the first time the question had been asked or the accusation lobbed. Saving your people is not saving all people. Can you do better?
Taking some of these comments on this point, if I can encapsulate them a little bit on a personal note. By the time the late 60s were hitting, I was a teenager who was losing his interest in comic books. I was a total comic book geek, but I felt I was outgrowing them. I had already discovered girls and got my driver's license, and my world was changing. But what Denny O'Neil did in Green Lantern, Green Arrow, introducing what we used to call relevant issues to the comics, burning issues of the day, and providing characters that too often in the past had been quite cardboard, with texture and layers to them, that he was maturing the comic book as an art form. He was helping make the graphic storytelling more sophisticated so that it was appealing more and more to high school, college, and beyond audiences. And I felt that with Denny coming in, comics were growing up with me. And as a result of that, I did not abandon comic books and continued it for the rest of my life.
I think Denny, thank you, Michael. I think Denny, you say about a hero, especially a superhero, but any kind of character in heroic fiction, that it's not that they win all the time, they experience setbacks and figure out a way to come back from that. And Denny, for better or worse, his life was full of a lot of very dramatic and life-threatening and psyche-threatening setbacks that he always came back from. And I think that showed up in his characters. I'm thinking specifically of what he did with Tony Stark and Iron Man, but also with Azrael. But just that was a hallmark, and that's when Denny really understood loss and having to rebuild and regain. I think that really came through in him as a person and in his work.
It was about redemption.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, he experienced it himself, and it became one of his major themes. And he passed that on to people like Frank Miller. It's, and I'm getting back to what Joe said earlier. I remember the '60s, Wally Wood saying to me, there's the good guys and there's bad guys, and the job of the good guys is to kill the bad guys.
Yeah.
This was, this was
An easy read.
the way it was done in the '60s. When Denny, revived the Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and revamped Batman. That was a huge change.
There would be no Batman movies these days done in a dark and serious way if it wasn't for the work of Denny and Neil Adams under Julie Schwartz as editor. It just wouldn't have been. And if you look movie by movie, whether it's Chris Nolan, Tim Burton, or whoever, you are going to see the dramatic influence of Denny O'Neil's work. And he is the reason that these are now working on a worldwide basis and transcending cultures as well as borders. Because what Denny was doing was something that had started, you all mentioned before. I think most of us who grew up reading comic books, even as little kids, Superman or whatever, so much of our moral and ethical code was influenced by these superheroes. And when Denny brought in all of these relevant issues to consider and to ponder, it continues to be an influence in my life and how I deal with all of these issues of ethics in particular.
I think. Oh, sorry, Mike. No, I was going to say, I think that what most stands out for me is that Denny humanized all the characters that he touched, whether it was Batman, who didn't have superpowers, or Daredevil, or even his run, which was very brief, on Superman. He stripped Superman of his powers by taking away, with kryptonite, taking it away, and made him human, so that what he was able to do is make these characters relatable to people. And I think Denny gravitated to that because he felt if somebody's flawed, then and human, then you could relate to them. And he drew, as everybody said, he drew off his own experiences, his struggles with addiction, his struggles with different health problems and things. Those all became reflected in his work. But I think what I was struck by, is that comics weren't really autobiographical in the same way. I mean, there were a handful of obviously people who were doing it, but not in the same way that Denny sort of, added his own ethics, his own biases to comics. And I think that's a big difference in what he brought to the medium.
Yeah, it's very funny. Denny and I once, when we all were working on Nightfall, all of the Batman writers, I wasn't a Batman writer at the time, I was Catwoman, but we were discussing the rights and the wrongs and who would do this and who wouldn't do that. And Denny suddenly said, talking about the difference between Azrael and Bruce Wayne, I'm not comfortable with this guy being a self-righteous absolutist, which is, it's like, whoa, I was talking about right and wrong, and now you're saying if you go too far one way or the other, you're not right anymore, you're self-righteous and an absolutist. And I think that was a very important part. Didn't want black and white. He wanted there to be textures and a continuum. And there was mostly gray, and then there was mostly not gray, but never the absolute.
Mike Gold, what were you going to say?
I think that it's important to remember that making that type of change, not just to an entire art form, but to specific money-based characters, Batman pays the rent, takes a lot of courage and a lot of stamina, and Denny did it so quietly at just the right time. Green Lantern was selling horribly. It was about to be canceled, so what the hell? They let him get away with this Green Arrow, Green Lantern thing. Batman had just come off of a mind-searing experience of juvenilia from the TV show, and then he comes in and turns him around, makes him who he always was, which really is sort of the bastard son of the Shadow, but with a family, and that's the difference. Denny's Batman lived in the real world. He wasn't quite part of it, and it took so much stamina, so much focus to pull that off in the corporate environment. I admire that, and I will forever.
Can I make an addendum to that? You know, it's like when Denny was my editor, my original editor on G.I. Joe. And in the first year, Hasbro introduced the only Asian character, Storm Shadow, who was a bad guy. You know, and my reaction to that was, yeah, I don't like this at all. And I went to Denny and I said, you know, I'm thinking that gradually over the course of the year, I'm going to like change him into a good guy in the continuity. And, you know, like, I think we should like talk to Hasbro about this. And Denny looked at me and he said, no, don't talk to Hasbro, just do it.
Right. Just do it. Absolutely.
Just do it. And, you know, I think, you know, he was always following his own advice with that, you know, and that's how, you know, he did ram stuff through. You know, he didn't like go to the suits and the powers that be said, shall we do it this way? He just, oh, let's just do it.
Quiet courage.
And it works.
Mike, on the point you mentioned about the Shadow being the major influence, at least, on the creation of Batman, isn't it interesting that when DC got the rights to the Shadow, they turned it over to Denny? And Denny showed that he could write just as brilliantly the most intricate period pieces and separate out the Shadow from the Son of Shadow, the Batman work that he was doing, and make those differences as stark as he could, where we saw all the interconnective tissue, but each one successfully stood on its own. And I think his work in particular with Mike Kaluta on that series is one of the gems of the era in comic books.
Well, with that, we're going to need to cut it off. This is Chris Morrow, remotely connected from home this year. We miss you, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
There we go.